And there's no need for taking copious notes. There's going to be a video available of this session. Will put a PowerPoint show. The URL is down there at the bottom of this slide. And there's also will be a PDF of all of my slides. So you don't have to distract yourself by taking a whole bunch of notes, but you might want to jot down your questions. We'll take questions at the very end. So this is a lot about me, and you can read this later if you choose. I think the more pertinent slide is this one. This is my list of clients after I left corporations in America and became a consultant. I joined a small consulting firm. There were 3 people there when I joined. I was asked to start the training practice area. So I had to create our methodologies in that. I hired staff. I used subcontractors to help me with that side of the business. The person that started the consulting firm was involved in strategic planning for training and development and spent years doing that for clients. And before that, he did that for AT&T headquarters in New York City. While this is an interesting list because it shows the diversity of companies and industries that I've worked in, it's this where these are in red. These red corporations, companies, enterprises, government agencies are where I used lesson mapping. Now, I had staff, they did this lesson mapping on some of my clients which were shared clients of theirs and some of their own clients. And I taught people at Amoco and at Eli Lilly and at General Motors these same methods, and then they used them inside their own corporations. This is all about performance-based lesson mapping, and performance-based or performance-focused or performance-oriented or blah, 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 blah is all about performance competence, which I define as the ability to perform tasks, to produce outputs or render services, a specific type of output, to stakeholder requirements. This is what it's all about. This is how I measure whether or not I've been successful. Did I improve people's ability to perform tasks, which are just the means to the ends of producing outputs? And if we want good outcomes versus poor outcomes, we need to meet the stakeholder requirements. And that begs the question, who are these stakeholders? So this model on the right, this stakeholder hierarchy, comes from an article that I had published back in 1995 in the Journal of Quality and Participation. And the premise of this article is, while the customer may lead in defining requirements, the customer is not king. If the government has regulations that will fine your company or throw people in jail if you meet the customer requirements, then the customer is not at the top of this hierarchy. And one of the clients I was working for back in the early 90s was running around saying, the customer is king, the customer is king. And so one evening in my hotel room in Fort Worth, Texas, I started this article because that's just not right. And it's bad enough when we share false notions such as the customer is king and we need to do everything the customer says. That's not true. But anyway, so I get triggered easily by things like that. So performance-based lesson mapping, this is the format. I first created the first iteration of this format for a client project back in 1990. It was for Illinois Bell, and they needed, for their new supervisors, they needed some training on um, meeting regulations and such. But so they had experienced some of my work working with a group in a facilitated group process where I had brought in master performers, other subject matter experts, sometimes supervisors, and sometimes relatively new performers in order to conduct analysis and also in order to conduct design. And their project was very contentious, and there was a fight between the labor relations community, because that's the regulation. The labor relations uh, organization wanted to update their training, but the field, the supervisors and managers and executives hated the existing labor relations training. So they wanted me to work with all of those contentious viewpoints and bring them to a consensus on how will we train new supervisors in labor relations. So one thing about the lesson map is that it sits in the middle of my design hierarchy. So I call things learning and development events. And yeah, you might say that learning is not an event. No, it's a chain of events. Some of them are formal, some of them are informal, but so we're trying to build formal instructional content, formal learning. Um, but there's an event that's the course or whatever, a module, and within that there are lessons, and lessons are like chapters in a book. So the event is a book, the lessons are the chapters, and inside the chapters are things that I call instructional activities, IDA, or information, demonstration, and application. Here's a made-up example of what that might look like if it was filled out. There's an open and a close, and then there's information, demonstration, and application in between. But when I do my design and when I do my development, I use a method that I learned about back in 1979 when I started in the business, where we do backward chaining. We start with the application or application exercise, otherwise known as practice with feedback. Then, if it's appropriate, we would design a demonstration and build a demonstration. And then we would provide information. We would select the information. We would exclude the extraneous information and focus on the essential information that would help the demonstration make sense, which is a demonstration of the performance that we expect people to be able to do once they've been through this learning or instruction or training. And then there's the application exercises, otherwise known as practice and feedback, but can also include a test, a knowledge test, or a performance test. If we teach you to do something, then let's see if you can do it. And we might call the first ones practice with feedback because that's less threatening. But if it's appropriate and it's within our culture to do testing of people's ability to perform, that last practice with feedback can be the final test, where people get a chance to demonstrate their performance competence. Okay, so what I'm sharing here is work for me in my context, which may or may not be similar to yours. I was an external L&D consultant. I was brought in to work with my clients on projects that were of high stakes, high risks, and high rewards. Nobody was bringing me in to do a couple of micro learning lessons, but this can apply to that as well. But again, so maybe you see my approach as overkill in the extreme, but it was not in my context. So I've been doing this my entire career, so you should feel free to do it as well. Adopt what you can and adapt the rest. And if you've come across something that you already have and it works well enough for you, then you can reject things that you learn. But otherwise, adopt what you can and adapt the rest. And that means changing the language and the imagery to better fit your context as necessary to that context. You don't embrace something and call it the same thing other people do if it doesn't fit smoothly and easily back into your set of philosophies, processes, and practices. So again, using analysis data, which I will also cover, we design and develop in a backward chain manner. We start with the application exercise, the practice with feedback, the performance test that is authentic enough to what we expect people to have to do back on the job, which means we got to know what people are expected to do back on the job. Then it's followed by a demonstration if it's appropriate. If we're dealing with incumbent performers as our learners and they already know what the performance looks like, we may or may not need a demonstration or a full demonstration of the performance end to end. It may be insulting to them, and of course, we don't want to do that. Now, when we're doing digital learning kinds of things, we can ask that they can skip it, if we empower them to skip it because they think they don't need it. But if we're sure that they really do need it, then we may not want to allow them to skip it. And then we build the information. And of course, we deploy this, we deliver it in a forward chain manner: info, demo, and appo. Now, I want you to take a moment and imagine backward chaining your last design or the current project that you're working on. And of course, according to the late Bob Mager, Robert F. Mager, you need to define your objectives. And I've had clients argue about objectives: primary objectives, secondary objectives, performance objectives, learning objectives, blah, blah, blah. So you use what your client likes and uses. Otherwise, it's an uphill climb. So the purpose for me is always to enable, and I want people to be able to perform tasks to produce outputs to those stakeholder requirements. And I start with, what's authentic enough practice with feedback. The best practice with feedback is doing real work and having some coach you through it before you start, as you're doing it, and afterwards, and providing you with corrective feedback and reinforcing feedback so that you can get ready to try it again, more than one and done. The demonstration, again, also has to be authentic enough, maybe not perfectly authentic, but authentic enough. And how do you know if something's authentic enough? Well, you test it out to see before you release it to the world. And then before the demonstration and application is the information. And again, that's the minimum information required, not everything that we could possibly provide to people, just the bare minimum essential content, information that they need so that the demonstration makes sense to them, so that they can be successful when they get into the application exercise and practice. We want people to succeed in the application exercises, but that doesn't mean that we always make it easy. One of my adaptations from back in the early 80s, when I was asked to start that training practice area, was to frame my process. And this is one of my PACT processes. I do curriculum architecture or instructional architecture, usually before this, and then we do product development. It's the same as systems engineering and product engineering. So this is the product engineering version of that. So I changed the old ADDIE model way back then, 40 some years ago, and put project planning and kickoff with my stakeholders, the requester and the stakeholders who have something to gain or lose, whether we do good or not. And then we go into analysis, we do design, we do development and acquisition. I've extracted pilot testing out of development and made that a separate phase because I wanted to make that key and important for my clients, that we're gearing up to get to the pilot test where we can do a full destructive pilot test. And if we can break our training, our instruction, our learning, then let's do it before we do a revision and then release it to the world. And then you do continuous improvement as needed. So for large scope efforts in analysis, I do analysis to define what are the performance requirements, and then we systematically derive the enabling knowledge and skills. And then that data feeds the lesson map. For smaller scope efforts, of which I have done some as demonstrations for my clients, but I'm usually not hired in to do small scope efforts, I would combine the analysis and design phase and do them simultaneously. Of course, that speeds the whole effort. And when you're looking at doing, a series of shorter modules or whatever, this might be the appropriate way to go here. But if you are dealing with high risk situations, you need to check in with your client and make sure that your analysis data is accurate, complete, and appropriate before you use it in design. And that's what those upside down traffic lights are there. It's where I do gate review meetings with my clients to make sure that they're okay with the data that I have and what I intend to do with it. And then they either okay that or redirect me, and then I go do what I said I was going to do or as redirected. So I do this analysis and design simultaneously. And what I've called this in the past in videos that are available at my on my YouTube channel is that lesson mapping on the fly. So quick and dirty or whatever you want to call it. But I ask these questions, and that's going to be the focus of my session today. So again, I'm usually using a facilitated group process where I've brought in master performers, people who are doing the job at a level of mastery yesterday. And today they're working with me so that I have current data about what the real world and what it takes to perform successfully. I might have also other subject matter experts, maybe people from regulatory affairs because that's important, or somebody from the law department because that's important, or somebody from the quality organization because that's important too. But those people from those other subject matter areas aren't master performers. They don't know what the barriers to successful performance are. They don't know how to really work around them. They don't know whether to embrace or ignore the company's official process, because sometimes they do, because they know that's what makes them successful. So again, the first thing I start with then when I'm doing this lesson mapping is I talk about the learning objectives. Usually I start with that, and then I go into what are the performance objectives. And other times I flip those two around and start with performance and then go to learning. But most people think, hey, we're here to design some training or instruction or learning. So learning objectives. And so, that makes them comfortable. People need to learn what? And then they need to learn that because they need to perform what? What is it we expect them to be able to do, which means we need to understand what people need to be able to do back on the job. Then we start with the application exercises or practice with feedback. We're trying to build skills and confidence and competence, the initial competence, to ensure better transfer back to the job. Now, I have 4 red boxes there in the application column, and those kind of represent 4 levels of application exercises, practice with feedback. The first one might be easy peasy. The second one might be difficult. The third one might be darn or damn difficult. And the fourth one might be from Hades, hellacious. It's the worst case scenario, and if we need to prepare people for the worst case scenario, then they better practice it before they begin out the job and be confronted by that worst case scenario. So that's the concept of the application exercises. Again, we might put in a demonstration if that's appropriate. And I allow the master performers to tell me, nah, they don't need that. That'd be, they'd be insulted. Or no, they definitely need it. They may think they don't need it, but they do need it. Or they definitely do need it because they're a bunch of new hires and they've never seen this before in their life. And so, yeah, it would be good to show them the performance that we've been talking about in information and get them ready for the application exercises. Then we can decide to put in some information. We may need to cover ABC and then XYZ, and then do a demonstration, and then do some practice with feedback, and then another round of practice with feedback. Then we give them some more information, then back to practice with feedback because we didn't need another demonstration. And then finally, we give them that final application exercise, which might be a performance test where we've allowed people to prove to us and to themselves that, yeah, they got it. They're ready to go back out on the job and perform successfully. So that's the info, demo, apo of lesson mapping. When we have this data, we can begin to look at, well, what content do we already have? And can we use that as is or after modification? So we can salvage prior investments in content that was either instructional or not intended to be instructional, but could be used in this instruction or training or learning. And when we have this data, we can also begin to ask, well, what barriers exist to desired transfer back to the job? I mean, if we train people, if we help them learn and master this performance, are they going to be able to go back to the job and everybody's going to be happy with it? The supervisor's going to be happy with it? The people they work with are going to be happy with it? Their customers are going to be happy with it? Or are those people likely to say, hold on, guy, I don't know what you're doing. I can't manage that. Or I can't work with that. Or that's not what I was expecting. And we have those kinds of conversations with our clients because when it comes to transfer of learning back to the job, L&D is pretty much powerless. I'm sorry, we spend a lot of time, you read a lot of stuff about L&D and what they should do to, but I tell clients in the very first gate review meeting that I have with them that I'm worried about transfer. And some of them say, you've not even done the analysis or design and you're already worried about transfer. And I go, yeah, I'm worried about transfer. And maybe you should worry about it too. You know, what's going to stop the learners from being successful at taking this back to the job? And I'm just being manipulative, devious. I'm trying to get them to start thinking about what could stop this huge investment that we're making from having any success, any chance of a return on investment. Are we going to spend and invest all this money and time for naught, for zero, for a negative return on investment? What could be in the way? And then I would tell those clients and stakeholders, well, transfer is really up to you because you own these learners. They're in your organizations. The managers report to you. This is really up to you, not me. So if we do this and it's successful, but it doesn't transfer, that's on you. Now we can help you from L&D in affecting that transfer, trying to improve it, trying to remove those barriers. And it's like my client, Eli Lilly. When they hired anybody to come in and build training for them, learning for them, they always required that there was a piece built for the supervisor. Because if there's anybody that's going to stop or enable transfer, it's those supervisors. All right, so for large scope efforts, back to that, um, I have a set of questions that I use when I'm doing the analysis. I generate that data. I have that little upside down traffic light there. It's not a stoplight, it's a go light. And at that gate review, they get to decide whether or not the data I have is appropriate to go into design. And I can tell them what I'm going to do in design, what I'm going to facilitate a group of master performers and other subject matter experts into creating. And one of the things I always warn them on is that, well, my design is going to be 60% hands on practice with feedback. And if you don't like that, you need to stop me right now because that's what I'm going to do, because that's what it takes to ensure that people have both the initial competence and the confidence they need to go back to the job and perform as taught. All right, so these are my questions. I'm not going to belabor these things. You can see them in the PDF that's available. This first part is to pin down ideal performance. What are the chunks of major performance? Is it something like ADDIE where you do analysis and design and then development and then implementation? You know, how do we break this up? You know, you can break an elephant up into 5 chunks or 7 chunks, but it all adds up to the same elephant. So how you chunk out performance might be different than how I would do it. But it doesn't matter if we've minimized or eliminated any gaps and reduced or eliminated any overlaps. That's the goal of these chunking into area performance, also known as major duties, key results areas. Tom Gilbert called them accomplishments, many different sets of words and language for that. Use whatever your clients use internally for your own success. So what are the outputs produced or services rendered? How do you know a good output from a bad one? What are their measures? Are there specific standards? If you said that weight was the standard, how many pounds or how many kilograms are we talking about exactly? Is there a range between 1 and 2 is fine or what? So that's what we really understand because people are on the payroll to perform tasks, not just to perform tasks, but to produce outputs of value, to render services of value. So that's where beginning with the end in mind starts. What are those outputs and what do the stakeholders require? Because to be successful, we have to help people meet the stakeholder requirements. And then we can talk about tasks. Now, when I first came into the business, task analysis was the big thing. And I'd see lists of random tasks that, yeah, people did that, but you didn't know what they were trying to produce. And so you can't assess whether tasks were done well or poorly unless you look at the output that was produced to decide whether or not that meets those requirements. And then we can talk about the roles and responsibilities. A lot of work is done in a collaborative mode. Not all of it, but a lot of it. So, who's involved? Who's executing the task? Who's supporting the task execution? Who provides input? Who reviews and provides feedback? Who can approve or reject the output or task? Are we clear about the roles involved in performance? Because learners need to know that, especially when they're brand new and we're trying to show them how they fit as a cog in the great big machinery of performance, that there are people that they need to work with and people that they're working for. Then once we've pinned that down, we can do gap analysis. This is part 2 of the performance analysis, which includes gaps. So we can identify, well, what outputs, measures, and standards are typically not met. That's typical gap performance. If we want to know what's atypical, because every 37 years this bad thing happens and we got to stop that from ever happening again. Okay, because we're talking about nuclear power facilities. And so, yeah, that's important to understand the atypical performance gaps and not just the typical performance gaps. But I'm coming at this from I'm building learning, so I need to know. So typically, what are the problems that are caused that cause us not to be able to build outputs that meet stakeholder requirements? And is that cause from the process itself is poor and inappropriate, and so master performers, they don't even use it. New performers, they use it, and it causes all sorts of problems because it's not a very good process, but that's what the organization has given them. Or is it a deficiency in an environmental support? Do they have bad data or missing data? What about their materials, tools, facilities? Do they have the proper budget and headcount? I mean, are we trying to get a 12-person job done with 3 people? Because that's not going to work. Or is it the culture and the consequences? We actually punish people for doing good work, guy. Yeah, we give our best performers even more work, and the people that perform poorly, yeah, we don't give them so much. Eventually, those best performers who are smart people figure that out and they start to slack off, and we don't understand why. Duh. All right, so, but there's also knowledge and skills because again, I'm coming at this from a learning standpoint, and if I need to know if the gaps are being caused primarily or partially because of a knowledge and skill deficiency. And then there's also the other things that the human brings to the performance party. They bring their knowledge and skills, but they also bring their attributes, physical attributes, psychological attributes, intellectual attributes, or personal values. And those all are necessary for the performer to bring to the performance situation, to the performance context. Now that I have all of that data and I understand what ideal performance looks like and what are the gaps and what's causing them, I can begin to systematically derive the enabling knowledge and skills. And for me, it's this categories, these 17 categories, and these are the kinds of questions I ask about them. But I'm not going to belabor all of that. I've got articles that are free, books that are free that cover all of these kinds of things, and etc. So let me wrap this up. Imagine in your last design or your next design that you identify what it is you expect people to be able to do task wise as a means to the ends of producing what outputs to what stakeholder requirements. And can you give them enough, authentic enough practice with feedback, a performance demonstration, and the absolute minimum information required so that you don't cause cognitive load to overwhelm them so they really can't learn much. I've got hundreds or thousands of resources. You can see the little red thing there that says my professional archive. That's where I've got today's presentation as a PDF, as a PowerPoint show. I've also got podcasts and YouTube channels, and I've published over 40 books that are available on Amazon. Remember, Apo, Demo, Info. I've got two books that focus on this. A lot of my books cover lesson mapping, but these two are specifically highlighting and emphasizing the lesson mapping portion of my methodologies. And remember, adopt what you can and adapt the rest. Thank you for allowing me to share this with you today. And now I think we're ready to go into some Q&A.
Thanks so much, Guy. This was incredibly methodical, and there were just nuggets of insights emerging through the presentation. And I just want to highlight some of the things that I specifically found most insightful. I think one obviously is to start from the end, but also your whole focus on gap analysis. Oftentimes, we think learning is the solution, but you're also talking about, is budget the problem, is culture the problem, is process the problem? So what are the reasons for those gaps, to really look at that and then see, what is the role of knowledge and skill, is what is the deficiency of knowledge and skills, and then to start from there. So just really found that really insightful. And also your, the focus on involving master performance and subject matter experts in even co-designing sort of applications. And then also, to realize that people are at different levels. So, not everyone needs a demonstration. So how do we design an adaptive solution so that, people can skip demonstration, but those who need it also have it. I also loved your focus on authentic assessments, authentic practice, authentic demonstrations. It's not, don't just create something so simple and that doesn't actually resonate with the complexity of real life situations. Just love that as well. And then the most important, bare minimum information. So what's the bare minimum information required for performance? Because just, I think we are very infamous for designing content that is just cognitively so heavy that it just doesn't work. And that's why I think, the engagement rates and the dropouts in self-paced programs, especially, so high. 4 to 8% people who join online programs even completed. So just, I love that focus on that. So Guy, let's get into some of the questions. I have some, but I'm going to invite everyone who's joining us today. If you have any questions based on the presentation that Guy shared, anything you didn't understand, or you're thinking about how this would apply to my context, or something that you disagree with, feel free to type that on chat. But Guy, I'm going to ask my first question. So, the one big question is really starting that came to my mind is around gap analysis. So you said that, and we realize that in our situation, there's just so many things that are resulting in that are obstructing performance, right? So can you give an example, a real life example of how you determine what requires a training solution, and some performance gap that actually requires some performance support, or management practice is off, or a new process that's required in the organization, or culture change kind of intervention? So how do you determine what requires training and what doesn't?
Well, I think that, it's important to always begin in the mind, and too often we begin in the middle. We focus on some topics and we're going to address that. We don't understand, what ends. Behaviors was the big thing in the 60s and the 70s. Then it became competencies, and currently we're seeing this skills mania. But if you address all those things, that's really education and not training. And so we want to help people perform back on the job. So you really have to start there. And once you've got agreement, a consensus with an assembled group of people, and got that reviewed with your clients, that the ideal performance is to produce outputs. This is how they're measured. These are the tasks. This is who does what. And here are the gaps. If depending on the credibility and validity of your sources, you're collecting that data, because unless you do that job at a level of mastery, how would you know? So I tell clients, I don't know. So that's why you got to give me your best people, and then I'll find out what they have to say, and then I can bring that back to you. So when the gap analysis shows that there are barriers to performance, the process, it's clunky, it doesn't work very well. But if that process meets the regulatory requirements and it's not easily changed, we may have to help people learn how to exist and use a faulty process. Now, and the clients might say, well, we can't change that. And the data and information, we can't change that. It's not really ideal, but it's all we've got, or the tools or such. So I worked with a client, was a defense contractor for the U.S. military and other militaries around the world, and that's a whole political issue or whatever. But but people were building parts, and when I met with the group, um, we said, okay, the first thing you do is you'll go get the work order, and then you go to the materials locker and pull the materials. And one of the engineers jumped up and said, wait, you go get your work order, and then the first thing you do before going and getting the materials is you go to this other file cabinet to find the engineering change notices so you can fix the faulty work order. And then after you check the file cabinet here, you have to go 2 buildings over to the second floor, find another file cabinet, because that's where they're actually working on the change orders, and see if there's any changes over there. So, and then you go get the right materials and then begin the rest of the process. So, what we uncovered in this meeting in the first 5 minutes was that the process expected the performers to go fix a faulty work order. And that's why, after 2 years of work, they had zero yield, spending millions and millions and millions of dollars building faulty parts because people had gotten the wrong materials, but they were the materials specified in the work order. So the client couldn't fix the engineering change order system, but they had to figure out, okay, we have to have our people actually dress up in this garb because it had to be a dust-free environment, blah, blah, blah. And they just needed to not do that. They needed to go get the work order. They needed to check that one file cabinet, the second file cabinet, come back, get the materials. And if this was in the middle of your shift and you were already dressed up, you had to undress, go and do all of that, come back, get all dressed back up again. And so this was not going to be easy for them to make this change because the workforce wasn't going to be happy with this all this extra rigmarole that they had to do.
Right.
So the client faced that, and we had to train people why, why would you need to go through all these supposedly extra steps?
Mm.
But the important thing is that you engage with your client and stakeholders and bring back data to them that's accurate, complete, and appropriate from valid and credible sources that they should handpick. And you are just the messenger bringing back the messages from the people who know best and getting the organization to look closely at the performance situation and why they were having troubles or problems.
Right.
Or even if this was just about new hires, this is what we need the new hires to contend with if we want them to be successful. And so it's really all about gathering that data. Sorry, that was a long answer to your.
Thanks, Guy. I'm just looking at the time. There are a lot of questions coming in, and we have limited time. So we'll just try and keep it, both the question and perhaps just a brief answer so that we can take more questions. I'm just I had another question, and it's actually connected to something Pavani is also asking. But requesting others, if you have any question, I'm going to hand over to Anil after this. So do share your questions. Guy, you spoke about application and designing authentic application practice tasks that resemble real world application. Pavani is also saying, while bare minimum information is agreed, we need bare minimum information. How do we arrive there? So we're talking both about information and then application. Any tips on, it could be tips, but it could also be mistakes you see people, learning professionals making, like what are bad applications, like what is bad content information, how do we design effective application practices and effective information?
Well, again, you're just trying to reflect what the work looks like and the same kinds of conditions as best you can when you're creating an application exercise. It's actually doing the work. What does that look like? What does authentic practice look like? Um, to minimize the whole information thing, if you're talking to what we typically call subject matter experts, they're going to give you everything because they don't know what does the new person just learning this need at the very beginning of their performance journey. And so that's why it's sometimes important to have relatively new performers who are bold enough to stand there and say in front of that subject matter expert, no, they don't need that. They need this and that, but not these other things. That's extraneous. That's overkill. They don't need that. They just need these narrow things. Because when an expert who maybe has decades doing this, they don't remember what it's like to be new and what you really need to start off with. And so you need to kind of counterbalance their deep expertise with more recent experience in climbing the learning and the performance curves.
Thanks, Guy. Anil, over to you. Let's take other questions.
All right, thank you. Thanks, Guy. That was very insightful. And thank you, Shraddha, for insightful questions as well. So let me go back and see. There were a few questions that came in from our audience. So Hassan wanted to know what was your definition in terms of like acquisition when you mentioned about the one of the term like development slash acquisition.
Yeah. So you can either build or buy. So there's, libraries of content that are available, and we can sometimes use them. Sometimes legally we can't, cherry pick and pull things out of them. We have to use them in whole. And it's overkill and it's more than people need, but if that's what you've got, that's what you've got to use. So it's always quicker and easier if you can get existing content rather than having to create content. It's no different than asking some AI tool, what content, and they'll give you a boatload of content, and you don't need all of that, and you can pull out just what's essential. But again, if you don't do this job for a living, you as a learning and development professional don't know what's essential, what's extraneous. And that's where we require working with master performers, other subject matter experts, relatively new performers who bring that perspective of, hey, this is what you need and don't need. This other stuff you can give that to them later. Start with this bare minimum of information.
Oh, cool. I really like the bare minimum part of the information aspect. We have another question from Bali. They wanted to know, like, especially the learning and development courses are very passive and click through, and they're used to that approach. So the approach that you are talking is very active and hands-on. So is there like a way to get buy-in from actual learners? Like, how would you do that?
So one of the things that active learning is very threatening. You mean I've got to do things and other people are going to see whether or not I got it well enough that I can perform in the application exercise? So one of the things that we have to be very careful about is that, passive learning, which isn't very effective, versus active learning, which is much more effective, especially if it's rooted in authentic performance, that's threatening. So we need to find ways to de-threaten, reduce the threat. It's like you don't throw people into the deep end of the pool, you put them in the shallow end and let them walk out to the deep end eventually. So we need to look for ways where we do application exercises, the APOs, and make them easy peasy. So that, we're just learning the process, the exercise, and all of that stuff. We make it easy enough that we reduce the threat. And in a group-paced training session versus self-paced, but in a group-paced session, I, as a facilitator or an instructor, would look for who do I think are the strongest people to lead the way. Because once other people see others doing it, they may feel less threatened about doing it themselves. And so this is part of the manipulation of a good facilitator instructor is cherry picking who's going to go first and provide a good demonstration in the application. Because the demonstration itself may ease some people's fears, but it's that fear of showing your lack of competence that really is something that designers really need to, and you need to be able to explain this to your clients because they don't want to, they just want to go for the, from Hades exercise, because that's what people need to be prepared for. And they may not appreciate because they're not close enough to it, or it's been too much time and distance for them to appreciate the fear that we can create. And we don't want to shut our learners down.
That's very insightful as well. Love your approach of gradual introduction for the audience, for the learners, instead of just throwing them out in the pool. So we have another question from John, who wanted to know, like, yeah, this is really cool, like what you were talking about, but still, if they're like, if the clients who are inclined to a more conventional knowledge transfer, so in terms of maybe he meant the client, maybe stakeholder, is there a way you approach in terms of persuading them to use this approach?
Well, this is in my approach because of how I framed my projects. As a consultant, I've come in, I've sold them something, I've sold them my process to produce something for them. So they've bought into that. So I get these chances. I have 4 opportunities to meet with the stakeholders. And I want a project steering team of the client, the requester, and the stakeholders to make the business decisions inherent in. And so one of the things I tell them at the very beginning is that I've created a command and control mechanism for you to control me. They love that. And I said, but on the other hand, that empowers me to get the right people at the right time to do the right things so that we produce something that's good for you. You win, your numbers will improve because your people's performance will improve. And so they tend to like that I see myself subservient to them, the business. We're not here for the learners, we're here for the business. The learners becoming performance competent is a means to the ends of the business success. That's sometimes controversial with people because a lot of us are humanists and we think, oh, it's all about the learner. But yeah, it's about them too, but it's about the bigger picture of their ability to perform successfully. And so I've got to get clients to understand that. And then I can talk to them about, we all went to school, we all learned a lot of knowledge, we saw people give us a lot of knowledge, they tested us, but they never tested our ability to apply it in the real world. That test back in the classroom or in a e-learning course is not sufficient to prove most of the time, depending on the audience's prior knowledge from education and experience. That it'll transfer, that will improve performance in a positive manner, and so that's what we want. So I've had a lot of clients who said, we don't need all that practice with feedback. And because I've assembled a group of people who probably don't all think alike, I'll usually have somebody else who will come in and disagree with that. And then they can battle it out, and I can take copious notes. And hopefully, they'll convince themselves that without practice and feedback, well, we should just send this in an email. We don't need an e learning course or a group session or a webinar, a MOOC, whatever. We don't need that because we can just give the information and be done with it. And then, but I need them to debate that. I need them to come to a consensus. This whole practice with feedback. I learned something from Neil Rackham. I'm sorry, this is going to take a little bit of time. He was meeting with my Motorola clients, manufacturing managers, and they were resisting practice with feedback. And he said, "Do any of you guys play tennis or golf?" They all did. He said, "Have you ever had a lesson from a coach?" They all had. And he said, "So did they change your grip?" Each and every one had been told to change their grip on the golf club or the tennis racket. He said, "So what happened to your ball control with that new grip?" "Oh, it went here, it went there." He said, "You had no control." So what the job of the coach is to reinforce the correct behavior, the grip, until the results become self-reinforcing. Because when you ask people to change, it's not going to go so well the first time they try to use that change, and they're going to revert back to what they were doing before because they had some semblance of control. So if we don't have people practice more than once, because one and done is seldom sufficient unless the prior knowledge, blah, blah, blah. And so they all of a sudden they got it because he had personalized it to their own experiences about how they too had learned the new grip, lost control, reverted, and then the coach berated them for having not stuck to the proper grip. And so that was very insightful for me back in 1981. And so I used that with my clients since those days.
All right. Cool. So basically you said focus on the org goal and then focus on improving the behaviors of the employee to
Yeah, but
change.
with the
Okay.
end in mind, are the results, are the outputs or services, are we seeing a positive improvement there? Do we have better quality, quantity, and reduced costs, otherwise known as better, faster, and cheaper? That's the measure of performance. That's what we're trying to affect. I don't care about smiles tests. I don't care about whether people thought this was fun and engaging. That's kind of beside the point. If they are more effective at performing back on the job and improving quality, quantity, and costs, that's what the business is. That's how the business generally measures their own performance. And we need to align to how they measure performance and use their metrics and their numbers to prove to themselves whether or not this was a worthy investment or not.
Okay.
Just looking at the time, we have 1 minute. Are we taking one more, Anil?
Yeah, maybe one more question,
Then
real quick, if you could answer.
we need a half a minute answer guy
Yeah.
then.
Yeah.
Very
So
I don't have those.
yeah. There was one question that said that if you start with the mapping lesson, you eventually stumble upon process and other bottlenecks. Like mostly then that's where the master performer becomes your ally. But is there any tips for a situation where you need to start with the lesson mapping?
No, I think the whole lesson mapping exercise means I need to have good analysis data. I need to know what the performance is, what the gaps are, what the enabling knowledge and skills are. And I either do that beforehand and get that data sanctioned, or I do it concurrently with the lesson mapping exercise by asking one question at a time and using that data and forcing that data into my lesson mapping in that backward chaining approach.
Okay, thank you, Guy. That was very insightful. Over to you, Shraddha.
There's so many more comments and questions coming, but Guy is, I think, she shared we'll share the link of his blog where you can find all of his videos and the articles he's written. He's also very active on LinkedIn. That's actually where we approached him and managed to get him here. So very approachable. So if you want to, I think, connect to Guy, he'd be happy to chat with you on LinkedIn as well. If you want to connect with more people who are here in the session, do stay back. Otherwise, we officially close the session. Anything, Guy, you want to say as we close?
No, just thank you for inviting me to share and keep that performance orientation. Begin with the end in mind.
Absolutely. That's the big message we are taking. So do stay back if you want to connect with more people. Otherwise, we officially close the session. Thank you so much for joining us today.